Alright, welcome back. So one of the first things I want to do before we get into any of the setting shit is I'm really tired of having to log in every time we debug the website. So I'm going to go into the add cookie here. I'm going to set cookie.maxAge to a year. Just so that we don't have to keep logging back in. So new time span. Let's do 365 days, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, 0 milliseconds. That works. And while we're here, all of these settings, like the cookie name, whether it's HTTP only, the security policy, all these should really be administrator settable. As another example of a settings object, let's create a auth settings class, and let's just use time span, session duration or session limit, and we'll go ahead and hook these up later on, but I would like to have a way for the administrator to change these things, because we've been hard coding a lot of stuff in our startup.cs, and that doesn't really make too much sense. Let's also just do cookie name, and we'll call that Wiki auth for now. Great, awesome. So what we're going to be doing today is making these classes a lot more accessible. So in our last video, we created these functions to make it really easy to just get these types, but we still have to dependency inject the settings object and then get them and then set them and do all that. So let's see if we can make this a little bit simpler. Wouldn't it be nice if we could just, instead of doing this, if we could just have a password policy here and just say, hey, instead of settings, I would like to have a, well, actually we already have a password policy, so wouldn't it be nice if we could just do that and then just say password policy equals that, and then we wouldn't have to have any of this shit here either. I think that would be really helpful. Let's get rid of that for now. So let's look at how we can make these things dependency injectable. Now, the obvious solution is that we can make every single one of these a scoped service, and in our startup.cs we could add, add scope for password settings, add scope for auth settings, add scope for, but I expect there to be hundreds of these. And the other reason why this isn't really doable is because we're going to have plugins. We're going to have a whole plugin framework, and there's going to be third-party plugins developed that get loaded, potentially at runtime. So we can't hard code these things into our services. So what we really want to do is we really want a way that someone can just create some type of settings class and inherit a base, abstract base class, and automatically have their settings restored and saved as necessary. So let's look at how we're going to do that today. So going back to our settings.cs, we're going to create a base class. We're going to say public abstract setting base. And this is going to be the base class. Oh, I guess I forgot the word class. This is going to be the base class for which we're going to inherit from. And that's going to allow us to put functionality in here that's common to all of these objects. So let's go ahead and go back to our auth, and let's inherit setting base on both of these. And while we're here, let's go ahead and rename this to password settings to kind of create a pattern. So we'll name these things something something settings, and they'll all inherit the settings base class. So if we go to real quick on the settings page, I'm also going to rename password policy to password settings just to keep it in line. And let's see if our view has updated, and it has. Perfect. Awesome sauce. It's another reason why you don't want to use HTML helpers. They won't update, they're just strings. So tag helpers, definitely. See, notice how these automatically updated? Alright, anyway. So back into our settings.cs file here. There's going to be a couple things that we want here. The biggest thing is we're going to need to have a reference to settings. So we're going to create a read-only property, and we're going to dependency inject it into our base class. So when we dependency inject each of these, like password settings, it's going to wind up injecting the settings into the base class constructor here. And that way we're going to have access to our settings service without having to ever dependency inject this into a page. Any page where we have some kind of settings that we need, this will already be dealt with. Just like how we didn't have to dependency inject database or the HTTP context accessor when we worked with those settings earlier. So if we look in the error list, we're going to have an error because we need to create a constructor that's going to pass in that setting. So we're going to say settings s, and then we just got to call the base class and pass that in. And this can be pretty much copied down to here as well. And we just got to rename this. Cool beans. Now, if we go back to our settings page, so we're dependency injecting this in here, and it's still a bind property, so all of our fields are hooked up. So the only thing that we really don't have is we don't have it in our services container. So like I said before, we could sit here and add scope for every single one of these. But rather than doing that, we're going to create an extension method just called add wiki settings. And let's also grab this out of here, and that can go in there as well. So bum 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 bum. I did not hit run. It just didn't. I didn't hit run. I know you're not going to build because I didn't write that yet. Duh. So back over here in settings.cs, let's create an extension method. So we'll need a public class. We'll just call it settings extensions. So in here, we're going to create an extension method called, we're going to return an iService collection, and it's going to be called add wiki settings, and we're going to take in an iService collection called services. I'm going to have to import this, so let's do that, and then we can throw that in there. That should all be happy. What is the issue? Oh, we have to return services at the end of our thing. Semicolon, please. Fuck you. Awesome. Now what we want to do is we want to add scoped, but instead of putting a static, not a static class, but instead of statically putting, like for example, instead of putting password settings and then authentication settings and all that, we really want to add scope for everything that inherits from settings base. So the easiest way to do that is through reflection. So the first thing we want to do is we want to get all the assemblies that are loaded. So an assembly is like the atomic unit of compilation in .NET. So this entire project gets compiled to an assembly. If we load any DLLs, like plugins, at runtime or not at runtime, each of those is going to be an assembly. So we want to make sure that we look in all of the assemblies, because there's a very good chance there's going to be settings defined in other assemblies. So this is how we get the list of all the assemblies. And then the next thing we want is we want all of the types. We want all of the setting types. So let's just say setting types. And we're going to say assemblies.select many. And in here we're going to say for each assembly we want all of the defined types where, and then for all the defined types we want the ones where base or setting base is assignable from that type. And I know that we're missing some parentheses in there. Hopefully that's the right amount. Okay, so for all the types that are defined in the assembly, we want all of the ones that can be assigned to setting base. In other words, they inherit from setting base. Now, for each of those, setting types, for each of those, we're just going to do services.add scoped on that type. And that should be pretty much it. If this works, our page should properly dependency inject the password settings class, and we should see our fields filled in. Can I instantiate implementation type? Said, oh, you know what? It's trying to include the base there. So what we can do there is, let's clean this up a little bit. So let's just say, put that on a line, put that on a line, and do we have is abstract? Yeah, so we don't want the abstract class itself. So it's not abstract. In other words, we can create it, and it's assignable from setting base. The issue was it was also including setting base, and that's abstract, so it can't be instantiated. So the services collection flipped the shit because it wasn't going to add that. So it looks like it started up here. And I'm logged in because my cookie is lasting. And I'm going to go to admin settings. And there you go. So we've just removed about 6 lines of code from every page that has to use settings. Now we're going to have a little bit of an issue here. Right now, this form looks fine and dandy, but we're going to have a big issue here. If I hit save, watch what happens. Could not create an instance of shittywiki.password settings. Model-bound complex types must not be abstract or value types, which it's not, and must have a parameterless constructor. So if you take a look here, if you take a look at what's happening, it's getting upset because when we post the form, it needs to create a new object of password settings so that it can fill in the values that were in the form. If you remember back from like the register form that we did when you create a user account, we data bound the user class, and when we clicked register, it would create a new user, and then it would fill in the various properties. It would fill in the username, the display name, and the email address. What it's telling us here is that it can't create a password settings class because there's no parameterless constructor. So if we look here, it's right, there isn't a parameterless constructor. We require a reference to a settings. Now, I don't know why it can't dependency inject settings. It knows how to create a settings. For whatever reason, ASP.NET will not use dependency injection when it's instantiating an object for data binding. I don't know why, but we can fix this. So let's look at how we work around this issue. Essentially, we really just need to create the object for ASP.NET and then let it fill in all of its shit on its own. So let's see how we would do. So ASP.NET has the concept of something called a model binder. Let's take a look at what that looks like. So let's create a setting binder and inherit from model binder. And let's just take a look at what model binder is. Let's import it and then go to definition on it. So a model binder is an interface that allows you to define a custom class that defines how a view binds with its backend model. And this can be used for all kinds of things. So like, let's say I had a field that takes hexadecimal and I wanted to bind that to a byte array. Or let's say I had a field that takes an RGB value and I wanted to bind that to a system.drawing.color. Anything along those lines. So they knew that you would have all kinds of bizarro custom types or even types that are built in that you're going to want to have control over how the form that the user submits actually binds to that. Whether it be in one direction, whether it be in the, you know, from the actual object to the form, or in the other direction from the form back into the object. So they created something that allows you to define a model binder. So let's go ahead and create a model binder similar to a trapper keeper, but it'll be a 3-ring binder. And what we'll do here, where the fuck is my settings file? All right, I'm going to start closing all these files. No, I want to save that. Where did it go? All right, now I'm going to close all these fucking files. So we're going to go ahead and implement this, and we're going to implement it explicitly because we don't need anyone else calling this function. And this returns a task, so it's an async function. You can tell because it ends with the word async. So in this function gets called whenever ASP needs to bind something that we've told that it uses this binder for. Now, how do we tell it that it uses this binder? There's a couple ways. One way is that you can go up here and you can say model binder, I believe. We have to import that. And then it accepts a type, and you can say type of setting binder. And now whenever it will go to bind to this model, it knows to use this custom binder. So what do we get here? Let's look at our binding context. We get a bunch of data. We get some metadata about the model. We get the model name. We get access to the HTTP context, which is going to be important. The model type, the field name. So in our case, it's password settings, but whatever the field name happens to be, the action context. So like whether it's a get or a post or whatever, the binder model name, all kinds of other shit, field name. So what field on the model it is. There's all kinds of shit going on here. So the validation state. But anyway, what we really want to do is we want to create the model. So in this case, there's two models that we're talking about. The page model is the page model. So if we actually go into the settings page, the pages view model is this class, the settings model. But then when it actually goes to bind this field, this becomes the model. This becomes the model for whatever it's trying to shove those fields into. So in the context that we care about here, because we're linking it to setting base, the model is actually going to be the type of settings we care about. So in our example, it's going to be the password settings object. So the first thing that we should really look at is we want to make sure that we actually are operating on the right thing. So I'm just going to paste this in because I already have it written off screen. And we want to say if we can't assign the model type to settings base, then this is the wrong binder. So this is just in case someone comes in and puts this on something that's most certainly not a settings class. The next thing we want to do is we want to actually get the settings, because remember, the issue that we had is that we need to instantiate this, a derived class from this, and we need this. This is the thing ASP is choking on. It's expecting this. It's expecting to just be able to create the thing with no questions asked, but there's questions asked, so we got to get an instance of these settings. Now, we can't use dependency injection here, so how do we actually get a reference to our settings? So that's where the HTTP context comes in. So we're going to say settings is equal to binding context dot HTTP context dot request services. And this is a services container that is going to contain all of the injected dependencies for that request. And then we can simply say get service of settings. If I needed to, I could say of database. I could do anything here that I would do like in a constructor. So here we go. We're going to get the settings, and now we have the settings. And then the next thing we got to do is we got to create the object. So we got to create the model. So binding context.model, and we're going to create it. Now we don't know. We can't just say new, because we don't know what type it is, right? It could be password settings, it could be auth settings, it could be something we don't even know about because a third party could have created that class. So the way that we do this is, if you remember back from my cats and dogs video like 6 years ago, the way that we create an instance of a class without knowing, without hard coding it, is by using the activator. So we do activator dot create instance, and it takes a type, and we have the type. It's right here in binding context.model type, and then it takes an array of arguments. There it is, an array of arguments. So we're going to create a new array, and in that array we're just going to pass in settings. Voila, perfect. So at this point we have created the settings object that it was choking on. Now the next problem, though, is that if we're using this model binder, we're no longer using the model binder that it was using before, the internal implementation that came out of the box. It's actually called complex type model binder. And the issue here is that I'm not going to sit here and populate all the fields on every one of these settings objects. I don't even know the fucking fields on these settings objects. So I need a way to pass control back to ASP.NET and let it continue on what it was doing. And this is an issue. So I can't do this the way I'm doing it here, where I'm just saying, hey, use this binder. The reason for that is because I don't have a way of creating the original binder under the hood. Like if I try to say, var x equals new complex type model binder, and I have to import this now. So if I do this, I need property binders, I need a logger factory. What the fuck is a logger factory? I don't know what this is. I can't create this thing. This thing is not, maybe there's a way that I could hack that, but I don't give a shit. So what we really want to do is in our class here, we want to get a reference to the fallback binder. So we want to say iModelBinder fallback. And we really need to have a reference to this. So let's create a constructor, and let's take in a model binder called fallback and capture that there. And then down here, we're going to await, because it's async, we're going to await fallback.bindModelAsync. And we're just going to call this function on that binder after we're done. And we're just going to pass in the same binding context. Now, this isn't going to work, first of all, because I misspelled this. But second of all, this is not, there's no dependency injection here. I cannot do this. If I try this, it will fail and tell me that it failed to create this. It just moves the problem one step further. It'll say that it can't create a setting binder because it doesn't have a parameterless constructor. So how do we get around that? Well, as usual with object-oriented programming, there's one more layer of abstraction. So if you can't build an XYZ, you build an XYZ factory. So in this case, it's not a factory, it's a provider. So if having an iModelBinder wasn't enough, there's an iModelBinder provider. So let's create a setting binder provider and implements iModelBinder. Oh, there is a factory. Are you serious? There is a factory. Jesus Christ, there's a factory and a provider. This is why people laugh at object-oriented programming. So if I look at what's in here, it's a simple interface. It has one function, getBinder, and it returns an iModelBinder. So let's go ahead and remove this because this isn't going to work. So let's go ahead and implement this explicitly. So now this is the getBinder, and what we want to do here, again, I'm just going to paste this in the interest of saving time. We're going to say, hey, okay, so if this context, so context it's similar to what we had before. Let's look in context. So we get binding info, we get model metadata, there's a metadata provider, there's the services provider, which is where we can get services, all kinds of crazy shit. But at the end of the day, what we're saying here is if the model type is a setting, it inherits from setting base, it's assignable from setting, it's assignable to setting base because this goes the other way around, then we're going to create a new setting binder. And what we need to do is we need to get a reference to the binder that we were trying to fall back to, the complex type model provider. So I'm going to paste in some more code because there's a lot of really long words here that I don't want to have to type. I'm going to get them wrong. So when we here's our constructor. When the provider gets created, we're going to ask it for the reference to the complex type model binder provider. Remember, we couldn't create the complex type model binder ourselves. So instead, we're going to create a complex type model binder provider, and we're going to capture a reference to that. And then when it's time for us to create our setting binder, we're going to pass in the we're gonna call the get binder on the complex type model binder provider, and that's going to create us a complex type model binder that we can give into our setting binder so that it can capture that as the fallback and then pass control back to ASP.NET later. I know this is really crazy. And if you talk to people, they're going to tell you that, well, my problem is I shouldn't be using dependency injection for settings. Fuck you. You know, they're going to tell me that's an anti-pattern, that's a code smell. You know, they can go fuck off. I will use dependency injection for anything I want to fucking use it for. People are going to prescribe that you write ASP.NET Core applications in a very specific way, and if you don't want to configure and then configure your services and set up your pipeline and do all that, then fuck you. So you know what? I don't care. I'm going to show you how to get what you want done accomplished without having to subscribe to any ideologies. So anyway, this is our setting binder provider. We shouldn't have any errors, and we don't. And now the last piece of missing information is, well, how does it create the setting binder provider? Where do we register that? Well, that comes back to startup.cs. So in startup.cs, under our add MVC, let me go ahead and break this out like so. Jesus Christ, can you just like know that I want the thing on the next line? Thank you. There's a model binder providers thing here, and you can add, but you can insert. So before all the other model binder providers, we're going to insert at the very beginning of the list a new setting binder provider. And this is going to want a reference to the complex type model binder provider. So how do we get that? Well, let's just fill that in for now. The way that we get that is that, well, we have a collection of all the model binder providers right here. So why don't we just use link, LINQ, to just go through here, put a where clause in here. X is complex type model binder provider. And hopefully I spelled all of that correct. And then I should just need to import it. There we go. Perfect. All right, let's see if that works. Let's run this. Let's get our database up. So right now our min password length is 8 and 32. So let's go to admin settings, and let's just try changing this to 9 and 30. Hit save, and hopefully we don't get an exception. We do not. Did this change? It did not. Oh, you know what? It didn't change because we didn't write the logic, but it also didn't crash, so that's a good thing. So let's go into our settings. That's CSHTML here. And yeah, we're not actually doing anything here right now. So wouldn't it be great if we could just say password settings.save? Well, we can, because password settings holds a reference to the settings object, so all we really have to do is go to our base class, go to base, excuse me, just go to the fucking thing. Don't give me no fucking lip talk back. So public void save, and we can just say settings.set and this. Awesome. So now it should actually set. I forgot that I didn't put that back in. So I'm going to go to admin settings, going to change that to 9 and 31, hit save. Whoa, what's the issue here? Oh, you know what? The cache has not been instantiated, so let's go ahead and resolve that. Actually, no, we don't have to resolve that. If there's no cache, it doesn't matter, because we're going to update the cache down here. So let's just add the Elvis operator and continue on. Fuck you. 9 and 31. Hit save. Boom. And we look at our database. 9 and 31. And it is a new item because the type changed name, so we'll just delete that just to prove out that it actually got written. Let's change that to 30. Refresh that. 30. So the only thing we actually have to do is, oh god, it's recursively doing that. We have to JSON ignore the settings, so that's not an issue. Let's go ahead and do that real quick, just to get that the fuck out of there. So in our base class here, wherever that is, setting base, we just gotta, because we made this a public property, we just need to JSON ignore this. So if I save that and I refresh, now it's 8 and 32. Now the real question is, why is it, if I refresh this page, I have a feeling it's going to go back to 8 and 32. And it is, so let's find out why that's the case. Alright, so there's just one line I forgot to put in here. When we create the settings object, we want to populate it with the settings from the database. That should pretty much be all that we need to do, so let's go ahead and check it out. I have some different values in here now, 145 and 555. So if they show up on the screen, then we know that it works. So admin settings, and they do. Let's go ahead and just change these back to 8 and 32, save it, and if I refresh the page, they should stay that way. And they do. Perfect. We're done. Awesome. So that takes us to the end of the framework for settings. I'm going to go ahead and check in my code. This is part 7. We're going to call it custom model binding. Model binding, one word. And there you have it. Questions, comments, concerns, complaints, comment below, like, subscribe, support me on Patreon, all that shit. Done with this. Have a great weekend. See ya. I'm out.